I saw the agents moving and hiding that Bigfoot. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I saw that night and why I can't keep quiet anymore. For years, I convinced myself it was better to stay silent, to protect myself and my family. But the truth has a way of eating at you from the inside out, and I've reached the point where I need to tell someone what really happened. Back in the early 2000s, I worked as an archival technician for a government contractor, not one of the big names you'd recognize, just a mid-sized firm that handled overflow work for various federal agencies. My job was simple and boring. Take old analog tapes from the 80s and 90s and digitize them so they could be stored properly. Most of it was mind-numbing stuff, like training videos, safety briefings, meeting recordings. Nothing classified, nothing exciting. Just hours and hours of grainy footage that nobody would ever watch again. The work was contract-based, which meant I'd go weeks without anything to do, then suddenly get a rush job with hundreds of tapes to process. I didn't ask questions about where they came from or why they needed digitizing. That wasn't my job. My job was to run them through the equipment, check the quality, and upload the files to whatever server they specified, easy money. And it let me work from home most of the time. I had a whole setup in my spare bedroom, 2 professional-grade tape decks, a couple of monitors, a decent computer with way too much hard drive space, and enough cables to make any IT person jealous. The room always smelled faintly of dust and old electronics. I'd sit there for 8 or 9 hours at a time, headphones on, watching decades-old footage play across my screens while I made sure the transfer quality was acceptable. Most tapes were exactly what the labels said they were. Forest Service training on wildfire prevention. Bureau of Land Management surveys of grazing lands, park ranger orientation videos. The kind of content that was important when it was made, but now just sat in storage gathering dust. My job was to make sure it didn't disappear entirely when the tapes degraded beyond recovery. I got paid by the tape, not by the hour, which meant I could work as fast or as slow as I wanted. Some contractors tried to rush through everything, but I took pride in the quality of my work. If there was audio distortion or video artifacts, I'd note it in my report. If a tape was damaged, I'd do my best to salvage what I could. It was boring work, but I was good at it. One Tuesday evening in October 2003, I was working through a batch of tapes from what I assumed was the Department of the Interior. Lots of forestry footage, wildlife surveys, that sort of thing. I'd already processed maybe 20 or 30 tapes that day. My eyes were getting tired from staring at the monitor, and I was thinking about calling it quits for the night. Just a few more, I told myself. Get through the rest of this box and I could take tomorrow off. I was maybe 3 hours into the shift when I grabbed a tape from the middle of the stack. It looked different from the others right away. The other tapes all had official labels, barcodes, tracking numbers, dates, content descriptions. Everything neat and standardized. This one had nothing but a strip of masking tape with handwritten text. Container 14, Redwood. I remember staring at it for a minute, wondering if it had been misfiled. The handwriting was shaky, like someone wrote it in a hurry or under stress. But the tape itself looked official enough, same brand and format as all the others. Sony Betacam SP, professional broadcast quality. The casing had some wear on it, scratches and scuff marks that suggested it had been moved around a lot over the years. I checked my manifest sheet. Container 14 wasn't listed anywhere. Neither was anything with Redwood in the title. Either this tape had been thrown into the wrong batch by mistake, or someone had deliberately mislabeled it. Either way, I figured someone just forgot to print a proper label and I should process it like everything else. I popped it into the player and hit record on the digitizer. The footage started normal enough. Nighttime, some kind of loading area with big industrial lights set up on portable stands. The camera was positioned at a distance, maybe 50 feet back, filming a cargo container. You know the kind? Those big metal shipping containers you see on trucks and trains, the ones that are maybe 20 feet long. This one was sitting on the ground in what looked like a warehouse or aircraft hangar. The concrete floor was wet, reflecting the harsh white lights, like it had been hosed down recently. Steam was rising from somewhere, creating these ghostly wisps that drifted through the frame. The image quality wasn't great. Typical low-light video from that era, lots of grain and contrast issues. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., August 14th, 1992. The camera operator was using a tripod because the image was perfectly still, except for the movement of people and that rising steam. There were people moving around the container, maybe 6 or 7 of them. They were wearing dark suits, which seemed weird for what looked like manual labor. No uniforms, no protective gear, no hard hats or work clothes. Just regular business suits like they'd come straight from an office. A couple of them had earpieces with curly wires disappearing into their jacket collars. They kept glancing around nervously, looking toward the shadows at the edges of the lit area. The whole scene had this tense, hurried feeling to it, like they wanted to be done and gone as fast as possible. Then I saw what they were escorting. At first I thought it was equipment or supplies covered with a heavy tarp, being moved on some kind of wheeled platform. It was massive, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall and probably 4 feet wide at the shoulders. The platform it sat on looked industrial, with big rubber wheels and a metal frame. But the way it moved wasn't right for cargo. The shape under the covering shifted slightly, and I realized with a jolt that whatever was under there was alive. The sheet covering it was heavy canvas, or maybe a thick industrial tarp, completely obscuring the shape underneath. You couldn't see any details, just this huge covered mass, but you could see breathing. The fabric rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, maybe 10 or 12 breaths per minute. Each breath made the whole covering shift and settle, and the size of it was just wrong. Too big to be a person, way too tall to be any animal I could think of. My first thought was maybe a bear standing upright. But bears don't move like that. This thing walked on 2 legs with a strange, deliberate gait, like a person, but heavier, more powerful. The men in suits kept a careful distance from it, at least 10 or 12 feet whenever possible, almost like they were afraid to get too close. One of them held what looked like a cattle prod or some kind of electronic device with 2 metal prongs on the end. He kept it pointed at the covered figure the whole time, ready to use it if needed. Another had his hand resting on a holstered weapon at his hip, fingers tapping nervously against the grip. A third man walked ahead of the platform, gesturing with his hands like he was directing the others. They guided the platform toward the open container, moving slowly and carefully. The wheels made a grinding sound against the wet concrete that I could barely hear through the static. Nobody was talking, at least not that I could make out. The whole operation was eerily silent except for that grinding and the occasional shuffle of feet. No orders being shouted, no casual conversation, just focused silence. These weren't workers doing a routine job. These were professionals handling something dangerous. I leaned closer to my monitor, trying to make out more details. The quality wasn't great. Typical VHS grain and compression artifacts, the kind of slight blur that comes with analog video. But I could see enough to know this was real footage, not some student film or hoax. The lighting was too professional, the equipment too expensive, the whole operation too coordinated. As they got closer to the container, one of the suited men gestured sharply with his hand, and the others stopped. Everyone froze in place. He approached the covered figure alone, moving carefully, and seemed to say something, though I couldn't hear any audio at this point. The figure shifted slightly under the tarp, like it was responding or acknowledging him somehow. He took a step back quickly, returning to the group. That's when I saw the hand. Just for a second, maybe two at most, the covering shifted and a massive hand slipped out from underneath the tarp. It appeared at about waist height on the covered figure, reaching out toward one of the restraints on the platform. The hand was easily twice the size of a human hand, maybe even larger. The fingers were thick and powerful looking, with what looked like dark hair or fur covering them. Even in the grainy footage, I could make out individual fingers, a clearly defined thumb, knuckles, fingernails. This wasn't a paw or a claw. This was a hand with an opposable thumb and articulated fingers. For just a moment, I saw it grip the edge of the fabric, the fingers curling around the tarp material with obvious dexterity. Then someone must have noticed because one of the suited men moved quickly toward the figure and the hand pulled back under the sheet, disappearing from view. The whole incident took maybe 5 seconds, but it was enough. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I hit pause on the digitizer and sat there staring at the frozen image. The frame showed the hand mid-retraction, still partially visible. The fingers slightly blurred from motion. I could see the texture of the skin between the hair, darker than human skin, almost leathery. Not a bear paw, not a gorilla hand, something in between, something I'd never seen before. I should have reported it right then. That was protocol for any unusual footage. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the weird feeling in my gut that this was something I wasn't supposed to see. I rewound a few seconds and watched that part again. Sure enough, the hand appeared, then disappeared. Not a bear paw, not anything I recognized. A hand with fingers and a thumb, but massive and covered in dark hair. I let the footage continue. The men guided the platform into the container. The camera angle made it hard to see inside, but I could tell the interior had been modified somehow. There were restraints visible, heavy metal fixtures bolted to the walls. The whole thing looked like it had been converted into some kind of mobile holding cell. Once the platform was inside, the suited men backed away quickly. One of them pulled a heavy chain across the container opening while another secured it with a large padlock. They worked fast, like they wanted to be done with this as soon as possible. Then one of them made a hand signal and the camera operator shut off the recording. The screen went to static. I sat there in my home office, staring at the static on my screen. The whole clip had been maybe 4 minutes long. My mind was racing. What had I just watched? Some kind of training exercise? But training for what? The fear on those men's faces had looked real. The creature, whatever it was, had looked real. I rewound the tape to the beginning and watched it again and again. Each time I noticed new details. The way the covered figure's shoulders rose and fell with breathing. The careful distance the handlers maintained. The heavy-duty restraints inside the container. This wasn't some low-budget movie prop. Everything about it screamed official government operation. Then something happened that still gives me chills. I was on my 4th or 5th viewing when the audio kicked in. Up until that point, the footage had been completely silent, which I'd assume was normal. But suddenly there was sound. Not dialogue, not machinery, just this low, guttural noise buried under layers of static. I turned up the volume on my headphones and listened closer. It was like a moan or a growl, but with this weird resonance to it, almost like vocalization, like something trying to communicate. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've heard plenty of animal sounds in my life. This was different. This had an intelligence behind it, a deliberateness that no bear or ape could produce. The sound appeared 3 times in the footage, always when the covered figure moved or shifted position. Each time it made my skin crawl. It wasn't threatening exactly, more like mournful or resigned. Like whatever was under that tarp knew exactly what was happening to it and was protesting the only way it could. I knew I should report the anomaly. That was literally in my contract. Any footage containing unusual audio, visual artifacts, or potentially classified material was supposed to be flagged immediately. But I didn't. I told myself I'd finish the digitization first, then decide what to do. That was my first mistake, the one that started everything. I completed the transfer, uploaded the file to the designated server, and logged it in my system like any other tape. Container 14, Redwood. No special notes, no flags, just another file in the archive. Then I put the original tape back in its case and set it aside with the others for return to the agency. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my mind. The massive, covered figure, the frightened handlers, that terrible, intelligent sound. What was Container 14? Where was it going? And most importantly, what was inside it? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I started digging. The government contractor I worked for had a pretty extensive archive system, and while I didn't have high-level clearance, I had access to enough databases to find basic information about most projects. Everything was organized by color-coded binders and compartments with different levels of access marked by different colored tags on the files. Red tags meant classified, off-limits to me entirely. Blue tags were restricted, but I could see basic metadata. Green tags were unrestricted, mostly public domain stuff. The tape I'd processed had no tag at all, which was unusual. It should have had at least a green tag marking it as General Archives. I started by searching for anything with Redwood in the title. The system pulled up dozens of results, mostly forestry projects and environmental surveys from the 70s and 80s. Nothing that seemed connected to what I'd seen. Then I tried searching by date range, looking for other tapes that had come in the same batch. That's when things got interesting. The batch I'd been working on was supposedly all Department of the Interior materials from 1987 to 1991. Standard wildlife and park service footage. But when I pulled up the full manifest, I noticed something odd. Several tapes had been removed from the original shipment before it reached me. The paperwork showed they'd been redirected to a different department for specialized processing. I traced the redirect code and found it led to something called Operation Redwood, a Cold War era program I'd never heard of. The database entry was sparse, just a project code and a vague description about biological surveillance and megafauna research. Most of the details were locked behind a blue tag, which meant I could see that the project existed but couldn't access the actual files. But there were a few documents that had been miscategorized as green tag, probably by mistake. These were mostly administrative stuff, budget requests, and personnel transfers, nothing too exciting. Except for one memo dated March 1989. It was a requisition request for field equipment, and the list was bizarre. Scent collection kits, DNA sampling equipment, audio recording devices capable of capturing subsonic frequencies, heavy-duty animal restraints rated for weights up to 1,200 pounds thermal imaging cameras, and strangest of all, a request for consultation with an anthropologist specializing in primate behavior. The memo referenced something called non-cataloged megafauna, which I had to look up. Basically, it meant large animals that weren't officially recognized or documented by science. The kind of thing cryptozoologists talk about. I felt my stomach drop. Was this actually about Bigfoot? That seemed insane. The government doesn't waste money chasing fairy tales. I found another document, this one from 1991, referencing sample collection events. It mentioned tree break patterns, dermal ridge analysis from hair samples, and something about anomalous mitochondrial DNA that didn't match any known primate species. The language was dry and scientific, but the implications were staggering. They'd found something real enough to study. The last document I found before hitting the classification wall was a status report from August 1992. It was heavily redacted, but one line was visible. Subject R14 acquired through non-lethal capture following incident in Humboldt County, R14. Container 14. The pieces were starting to fit together, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. Whatever I'd seen on that tape wasn't a training video or special effects. It was documentation of an actual capture. They'd caught something in the redwood forests of Northern California and transported it somewhere. The question was where and what had they done with it? I spent the next week obsessing over this. Every spare moment I had, I was searching databases and reading through files. I'd finish my regular work for the day, then spend hours digging through the archive system looking for anything related to Operation Redwood or Subject R14. I started keeping notes in a spiral notebook, documenting everything I found, drawing connections between different documents and dates. My handwriting got messier as the week went on, scrawled observations and questions filling page after page. I started having trouble sleeping. When I did manage to drift off, I'd have dreams about that covered figure, about that massive hand reaching out. Sometimes in the dreams I could see under the tarp, and what I saw was different every time. Sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes something in between. I'd wake up in a sweat, heart racing. The image of those frightened handlers burned into my mind. My partner noticed I was distracted. She'd ask me questions, and I'd realize I hadn't heard a word she said. Dinner would get cold on my plate while I stared into space, thinking about shipping containers and classified projects. When she asked if something was wrong at work, I made up some excuse about a difficult project with tight deadlines. I couldn't exactly tell her I thought I'd stumbled onto evidence that the government had captured Bigfoot. She would have thought I was losing my mind. Hell, I was starting to wonder the same thing myself. But the evidence kept piling up. Every document I found, every reference to Operation Redwood, it all pointed to the same conclusion. They'd been hunting something in the Pacific Northwest, something large, something intelligent enough to evade detection for decades. And in August 1992, they'd finally caught one. Then something happened that made everything worse. I was working late one Friday night, processing a new batch of tapes when my security badge malfunctioned. These badges used magnetic strips to track our access to different areas of the building and different levels of the database system. Mine had worked fine for 3 years, never a single problem. But suddenly, out of nowhere, it stopped working for anything related to Operation Redwood. I'd try to search for Redwood files and get an access denied error. I'd try a different search term, something I knew I'd accessed successfully the day before, and the same error message would pop up, red text on black background. Access denied, insufficient clearance level. But I could still access everything else normally. All my other databases, all my other files, everything worked fine. It was like someone had specifically locked me out of that one area, that one topic. I called IT to report the malfunction. It was late, almost midnight, but they had someone on call for emergency system issues. The tech who answered sounded half asleep at first, but he woke up quick when I explained the problem. He put me on hold while he ran some diagnostics. I could hear him typing in the background, mumbling to himself, clicking through screens. After maybe 5 minutes, he came back on the line, sounding confused. He said my badge was working fine, showing full green status in the system. All permissions were normal, no flags, no restrictions. According to his diagnostics, I should have been able to access those files without any problems. The system showed no reason why I'd be getting denied access. I tried again while he was on the phone with me, searching for the same files I'd been able to read just yesterday. Same result. Access denied. He heard the error beep through the phone and went quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd escalate it to his supervisor, that maybe there was a server issue they weren't seeing on their end. He took my employee number and promised someone would call me back within 24 hours. Nobody ever did. I waited all weekend, checking my phone every hour. Monday came and went, then Tuesday. No call, no email, no follow-up. When I tried calling IT again, I got a different tech who had no record of my previous call in the system. He offered to file a new ticket, but something in his voice told me it wouldn't make any difference. That's when I started to get scared. Not scared like watching a horror movie, but genuinely frightened for my safety. Someone was monitoring my access attempts. Someone knew I'd been digging into Operation Redwood, and someone had decided I needed to be cut off from that information. I should have stopped there, backed off, forgotten the whole thing, gone back to my boring routine. But I'd seen too much. I needed to know what happened to Subject R14. I needed to understand what I'd witnessed on that tape, so I did something risky. Before my access had been blocked, I'd downloaded some of the unrestricted documents to my personal laptop. Not the classified stuff, just the administrative files and memos I'd found. I started going through them more carefully, looking for names, looking for anything that might lead me to someone who had actually worked on the project. Most of the names were redacted or coded, but one kept appearing in the personnel transfers, someone identified only as Agent M. Hale. He'd been reassigned from the project in late 1992. Around the time the document stopped, I ran the name through some public databases, looking for anyone with that name who'd worked for federal agencies in the early 90s. It took me 2 weeks, but I finally found him. Marcus Hale, retired federal agent, living in a hospice facility in Oregon. The man was in his 70s now, dealing with some kind of degenerative illness. Part of me felt guilty for even thinking about bothering him. But I had to know. I had to hear the truth from someone who'd been there. I took a weekend trip to Oregon, telling my partner I needed to visit an old friend. The hospice was a nice place, clean and quiet, with gardens outside the windows I'd called ahead and gotten permission to visit, saying I was a family friend. The nurse who checked me in said he didn't get many visitors anymore. When I walked into his room, I found a frail old man sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the trees. His hands shook slightly, and his eyes had that distant look you see in people who've started disconnecting from the world. I almost turned around and left. What was I doing, bothering this dying man with questions about something that happened 30 years ago? But then I pulled out my phone and showed him a still frame I'd captured from the footage. The massive, covered shape being wheeled into the container. Just for a second, I saw something change in his eyes. Recognition. And then fear. His hand started shaking worse. He tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that confirmed everything. "We shouldn't have brought it in alive. We shouldn't have brought it in alive." That's what he said. Those were the first words out of his mouth after looking at the photo on my phone. Not a question, not a denial, just a statement of regret that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I pulled up a chair and sat down next to his wheelchair. The hospice room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of a monitor somewhere down the hall. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, making dust particles dance in the air. He kept staring at the photo, his shaking hands reaching toward my phone but not quite touching it, like he was afraid of what might happen if he made contact. I asked him to tell me what happened. He was quiet for a long time, so long I thought maybe he'd changed his mind about talking. Then he started crying. Not sobbing, just tears running down his weathered cheeks while he stared at that image of the covered figure being wheeled into the container. "It wasn't alone," he finally said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It wasn't alone, and they warned us. They warned us not to take it." He told me the whole story then, speaking slowly, sometimes stopping to catch his breath or collect his thoughts. Operation Redwood had started in the late 70s as a biological surveillance project. The official mission was to catalog and monitor large predator populations in the Pacific Northwest, tracking bears and mountain lions, that sort of thing, standard wildlife management stuff on paper. But there was an unofficial component. Reports kept coming in from Forest Service personnel, loggers, hikers, sightings of something that didn't fit any known species. Massive footprints, 18 inches long, tree breaks 12 feet off the ground. Vocalizations that couldn't be matched to any cataloged animal hair samples, with DNA that was almost human but not quite, almost ape but not quite. Something in between. For years, they just collected data, scent marking, audio recordings, plaster casts of prints. They set up remote cameras in promising areas and reviewed thousands of hours of footage. Most of it was nothing, just bears and deer and the occasional hiker. But every once in a while, they'd catch something. A shape moving through the trees too tall to be human. A figure crossing a ridge at night, illuminated briefly by moonlight. Always distant, always blurry, but consistent. Something was out there. Then in August 1992, they got a call from the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. A group of hikers had gotten lost in the redwood forests. 4 people, including 2 children they'd been missing for 3 days, and search and rescue was having trouble finding them because of the terrain. The forest there is dense, almost impenetrable in places, with ravines and thick underbrush everywhere. On the 4th day, the hikers walked out on their own, all 4 of them, tired and hungry but unharmed. When the sheriff questioned them about how they'd survived, how they'd found their way back, they told a strange story. Something had been following them through the forest, a huge figure walking upright, keeping pace with them through the trees. At first, they'd been terrified, thought it was going to attack them. But it didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to be guiding them. When they'd go the wrong direction, toward dangerous drop-offs or away from water sources, it would make noise to get their attention. They'd hear wood knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, or they'd see it standing ahead of them on the trail, blocking the path until they turned around. On the 3rd night, they'd woken to find a pile of berries and edible plants next to their makeshift camp. No footprints, no sign of who left them, but the hikers knew. The sheriff thought they were suffering from exposure, making up stories, but he filed a report anyway, and that report made its way to Operation Redwood. Someone higher up made a decision. If these creatures were real and they were interacting with humans, that changed everything. They needed a specimen. They needed to study one. Hale was part of the capture team. He said they went in with tranquilizer guns, professional trackers, thermal imaging equipment. They found the area where the hikers had been guided out, and they set up a perimeter. It took 2 weeks of waiting, but eventually their cameras picked up movement. A massive figure, maybe 8.5 feet tall, moving through the forest at night. They tracked it for 3 days. Every time they got close, it would disappear, moving through the terrain faster than seemed possible for something that size. But they were patient. They set up bait, food supplies left in clearings, fresh fruit, dried meat, things that would attract a hungry animal. The creature ignored all of it. Then they tried something different. They played recordings of the wood knocking sounds the hikers had described. Rhythmic patterns, like someone tapping on hollow logs. Within an hour, they got a response. The same pattern knocked back from the forest, maybe a quarter mile away. They'd made contact. What happened next, Hale said, still haunts him. The Bigfoot walked into their camp, not sneaking, not cautious. It just walked right in broad daylight. and stood there at the edge of the clearing looking at them. Hale described its eyes as the most disturbing part. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. It was studying them the same way they'd been studying it. The team was frozen, nobody sure what to do. This wasn't how captures usually went. Then one of the younger agents raised his tranquilizer rifle. The Bigfoot didn't run, it just stood there, watching. The agent fired, hitting it in the shoulder. The Bigfoot flinched but didn't move. A second dart hit it in the chest. Still it stood there, those intelligent eyes moving from person to person like it was memorizing their faces. It took 3 more darts before it finally went down. 5 times the dose that would drop a grizzly bear. Even then, it didn't collapse so much as lower itself to the ground slowly, deliberately, like it was choosing to surrender, rather than being forced down. The whole time, its eyes stayed open, watching them approach. That's when they heard the others. Wood knocking coming from all around them, dozens of sources in the forest. The thermal cameras showed heat signatures in every direction. Large figures, at least 10 or 12 of them standing in the trees watching. The team realized with a cold dread that they'd walked into a trap. Or maybe not a trap, Hale said. Maybe the Bigfoot they'd captured had offered itself up to protect the others, to protect the lost hiker's rescuer from being hunted down. They covered it with a tarp and got it onto a transport platform as fast as they could. The wood knocking continued the entire time, this complex pattern of sounds that seemed like communication. Hale said it sounded like a conversation, like the creatures in the forest were talking to the one they'd captured. And it was responding, even unconscious. Every few minutes, it would make this low vocalization, this rumbling sound that carried through the trees. They transported it to a temporary facility, the one in the footage I'd seen. The operation went smoothly, professionally. They got it into the modified shipping container, secured it, documented everything by the book. But Hale said something was wrong from the start. The other team members felt it too. This thing they'd captured, it wasn't struggling or trying to escape. It was just watching them with those eyes, like it was waiting for something. I asked him what happened next, where they took it. He shook his head slowly. That's the thing, he said. They only had it for 48 hours, 2 days. In that time, they tried to study it, document it, take samples. It cooperated with everything, opened its mouth when they needed to examine its teeth, extended its arms when they wanted measurements. It was like dealing with a patient human subject, not a wild animal. You can't bury that kind of intelligence in a report, Hale whispered. Its eyes followed every one of us. It knew what we were doing. It understood. After leaving the hospice, I couldn't stop thinking about what Hale had told me. 48 hours. They'd only held subject R14 for 2 days before something happened. But what? He'd been too exhausted to continue, and the nurse had come in to give him his medication, politely suggesting I come back another time. I'd left my phone number, hoping he'd call when he felt up to talking more. 3 days later, I came home from running errands to find an unmarked manila envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no postage stamp, just my name written on the front in the same shaky handwriting I'd seen on that tape label container 14. Redwood. My hands were trembling as I opened it. Inside were photocopies, dozens of pages, some clear, some so faded I could barely read them. Observation logs from the first 48 hours after R14's capture. Someone, probably Hale, had kept copies all these years, and now he was giving them to me. The first entry was dated August 18th, 1992, 2:30 a.m. It ascribed the subject being placed in the containment facility, a modified warehouse on a military base whose name was redacted. The logs noted its vital signs, all within normal ranges for a large primate. Heart rate elevated but steady, breathing regular, no signs of distress from the tranquilizers. At 6:15 a.m., the subject regained consciousness. The observation team noted it remained calm, making no attempt to test the restraints. It sat upright on the platform they'd provided and looked around the room slowly, methodically examining every camera, every corner, every piece of equipment. One note stuck out. Subject appears to be conducting its own assessment of the facility. Behavior suggests high cognitive function. At 8 a.m., they offered it food: fresh fruit, vegetables, raw meat, various nuts and berries. The subject examined each item carefully but refused to eat. It did accept water, drinking several gallons from a large container they provided. The logs noted it used both hands to lift the container, displaying remarkable dexterity and control for something with such massive hands. Throughout the first day, the subject remained mostly still and quiet, but several times it made vocalizations, low, rumbling sounds that the audio equipment barely picked up. The team brought in a sound analysis expert who determined the vocalizations contained distinct patterns, possible linguistic structures. They weren't random noises, they were deliberate communication attempts. One entry from the afternoon of day 1 caught my attention. It read, "At 2:45 p.m., subject began making repetitive vocalizations. Sound analysis suggests it is mimicking human speech patterns." After approximately 15 minutes, it clearly vocalized the name Hail. The subject repeated this name 7 times, each repetition growing clearer and more precise. It was trying to communicate. It had heard them using each other's names during the capture, and it was trying to use that information to establish contact. The idea sent chills down my spine. This wasn't an animal. This was something that understood names, understood that individual humans had distinct identities. The logs from day 2 showed increasing agitation, not from the subject but from the observation team. Multiple entries mentioned the subject's eyes, how it would maintain eye contact for extended periods, how it seemed to be studying them as much as they were studying it. Several team members requested to be rotated out, reporting feeling uncomfortable under its gaze. The sound was loud enough that the team in the observation room could hear it through the soundproofed walls, and from outside the facility, they heard a response. The same clicking patterns coming from the forest beyond the perimeter fence. The logs became more frantic after that. Security footage showed multiple thermal signatures outside the facility. Large figures, at least 15 or 20 of them, surrounding the building. They weren't trying to break in, weren't making threatening gestures. They were just there, waiting. The subject inside the facility continued its clicking communication, and the ones outside responded in kind. A note from the facility commander at 3:30 p.m. Subject has not attempted escape, but appears to be in contact with others outside perimeter. Recommend immediate transport to more secure location. This situation is untenable. But before they could arrange transport, the weather turned. A massive storm system moved in, one of those Pacific Northwest thunderstorms that seems to come out of nowhere. The logs noted wind speeds reaching 60 miles per hour, torrential rain, lightning strikes hitting trees around the facility. The power went out at 11:15 p.m. The backup generators kicked in, but they only powered emergency lighting. The observation equipment, the cameras, the audio monitoring all went dark. For approximately 40 minutes, the team had no eyes on the subject. They could hear it though, still making those clicking sounds, now faster and more urgent. When the power came back, the subject was agitated. It paced the containment area, stopping periodically to listen at the walls. The thermal cameras outside showed the figures in the forest had moved closer, right up to the perimeter fence. Some of them appeared to be testing the fence, shaking it, looking for weak points. The final log entry I received was timestamped 2:47 a.m. on August 20th, 1992. It read, "Multiple impacts detected on perimeter fence. Thermal imaging shows approximately 24 large subjects attempting to breach security. Subject R14, increasingly distressed, vocalizing continuously. Facility commander has ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate. Will attempt to maintain containment until daylight, when armed response can be coordinated." That was it. That was the last page in the envelope. Whatever happened after 2:47 a.m. wasn't documented, or at least Hale didn't have those records. But he'd told me at the hospice that they'd only held the Bigfoot for 48 hours, which meant something must have happened in those early morning hours of August 20th. I called the hospice and asked to speak with Hale. The nurse who answered said he'd asked her to give me his room number if I called. He was expecting me. When I arrived at the hospice the next day, Hale looked worse than before. The medication was taking its toll, and he seemed to be fading. But his eyes were clear and focused when I walked in. He'd been waiting for me, he said, waiting to tell me the rest of the story before he ran out of time. I asked him what happened that night after the logs ended. He took a long, shaky breath and began to speak. His voice was weak, but his memory of that night was crystal clear. He said some things you never forget, no matter how hard you try. The storm had knocked out the main power, and they were running on generators. The backup lighting was dim, creating shadows everywhere. The team was on edge, watching the thermal cameras show those massive figures surrounding the building. Hale was in the observation room with 3 other agents, all of them armed, all of them trying to figure out what to do. The facility commander wanted to call in military support, but that would mean acknowledging what they had. The whole operation had been kept quiet, off the books, classified above top secret. Bringing in outside help would expose the entire program, so they were on their own, a dozen agents trying to hold a facility against an unknown number of creatures that were clearly intelligent enough to coordinate an assault. Around 3 a.m, the impacts on the fence stopped. The thermal cameras showed the figures retreating back into the forest. For about 20 minutes, everything was quiet. The team started to relax, thinking maybe the storm had driven them away. Then they heard it, a sound that came from everywhere at once, echoing through the facility. It was like singing, Hale said, but deeper than any human voice, a chorus of those creatures in the forest, all vocalizing together in this haunting, harmonious pattern. And inside the containment room, Subject R14 was singing back. The same patterns, the same tones, creating this call and response that sent chills through everyone who heard it. Hale said it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Whatever it wasn't animal behavior. This was culture, language, something that spoke to intelligence and social structure. That's when Hale made his decision. He was the senior agent on site, and he realized they were in over their heads. These weren't animals they could just lock up and study. These were beings with families, with social bonds strong enough to risk confronting armed humans. The one they'd captured had surrendered to protect the others, had offered itself up to save the hikers it had helped. He told the team to stand down. Over the objections of the facility commander, over the protests of the other agents, he ordered them to open the containment area. The commander threatened to have him court-martialed, but Hale didn't care. He'd spent 2 days watching this creature, seeing the intelligence in its eyes, listening to it try to communicate. Keeping it locked up wasn't research, it was kidnapping. They opened the doors. Hale walked down to the containment room himself, despite everyone telling him it was suicide. He approached the door slowly, hands visible and empty. Through the observation window, he could see R14 standing at the far wall, watching him. When he opened the door, the Bigfoot didn't rush forward or attack. It just stood there looking at him with those intelligent eyes. Hale said he spoke to it, just said out loud that it could go, that he was sorry they'd taken it, that he understood now. The Bigfoot tilted its head slightly like it was listening, processing the words. Then it walked forward slowly and deliberately. When it reached the doorway where Hale was standing, it stopped. They were face to face, or as close as they could be with the massive height difference. The Bigfoot reached out one of those huge hands and touched Hale's shoulder, just rested it there for a moment, the weight of it making Hale's knees buckle slightly. The hand was warm, the grip gentle but powerful. Then it made a sound, a low vocalization that Hale swore sounded like gratitude. The Bigfoot released him and walked past, heading toward the exterior doors. The team opened the outer doors from the control room. Rain was still pouring down, lightning illuminating the forest beyond the facility. The Bigfoot walked out into the storm without looking back. As soon as it cleared the building, the thermal cameras picked up the other figures emerging from the tree line. They surrounded the released subject, and Hale said you could see them touching it, checking it over, what looked like concern and relief in their movements. Then they all looked back at the facility. Dozens of those creatures standing in the rain, all facing the building where the humans watched through cameras. For a long moment, nobody moved. It felt like some kind of acknowledgement, Hale said, like they were saying they understood what had happened, that the humans had let their family member go. Then they turned and walked into the forest. Within minutes, the thermal cameras showed nothing but empty forest and rain. They were gone, all of them, like they'd never been there. Hale was reprimanded, of course, threatened with everything from termination to prosecution, but they couldn't make a big deal of it without revealing what had happened, what they'd been doing. So they quietly reassigned him, buried the whole incident under layers of classification, and shut down Operation Redwood. The official story was that the program had failed to produce actionable intelligence and was being terminated for budgetary reasons. The tape I'd found, the footage of R-14 being loaded into the container, that was supposed to have been destroyed along with all other physical evidence. Someone must have missed it during the purge, or maybe someone kept it deliberately as insurance. Either way, it had ended up in that batch of tapes 30 years later, waiting for someone like me to find it. Hale looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said he'd carried the secret for decades, wondering if he'd done the right thing, wondering if letting it go meant other people might get hurt, might have encounters without being prepared. But every time he questioned himself, he remembered those eyes, the intelligence there, the awareness. You can't lock up a thinking, feeling being just because you're curious about it, he said. That makes you the monster, not them. I stayed with him for another hour, listening to smaller details, question about what he remembered. Then the nurse came in again, this time more insistent. He needed rest. As I stood to leave, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Do you hear them in the forests at night?" he asked. "They don't scream, they talk. Always remember that. They talk." Hale died 2 weeks after our last conversation. The hospice called to tell me he'd passed peacefully in his sleep. I didn't go to the funeral. I'd never met his family, and explaining how I knew him would have been complicated. But I thought about him constantly, about his courage in letting that Bigfoot go, about the weight of the secret he'd carried all those years. I couldn't let it end there. I had all this information, all these pieces of proof that something incredible had happened. But I had no idea what to do with it. Publishing it would get me laughed at, or worse, bring unwanted attention from whatever agencies had classified Operation Redwood in the first place. My access to the archives had already been blocked, which meant someone knew I'd been digging. So I did something probably stupid. I decided to go see the location myself. The documents Hale had given me included coordinates for where R14 had been captured in the redwood forests of Humboldt County. I took a week off work, told my partner I needed some time to clear my head, and drove north to California. The forests there are otherworldly. Trees hundreds of feet tall, trunks wider than cars, creating this canopy so dense that the forest floor is in permanent twilight. The air smells of earth and pine and something ancient. You can walk for hours and never see another human being. It's easy to understand why something could hide there, could live there for centuries without being definitively proven. I hiked in during the afternoon, following the coordinates from the capture report. The terrain was rough, steep ravines and dense undergrowth, but I'd come prepared with proper gear. By the time I reached the area, the sun was low in the sky, that golden late afternoon light filtering through the trees in shafts and beams. I set up a basic camp in a small clearing, just a sleeping bag and some supplies. I wasn't planning to stay overnight, but I wanted the option if I found something interesting. Mostly, I just walked around looking at the forest, trying to imagine what had happened here 30 years ago. Where the Bigfoot had been when they darted it, where the others had stood watching from the trees. As the sun set and darkness crept through the forest, I started to feel uneasy. Not scared exactly, but aware that I was being watched. You know that feeling when the hair on your neck stands up and your instincts tell you that you're not alone? I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just nerves, that I'd read too much about Bigfoot and was letting my imagination run wild. Then I heard it. Click, click, click. Rhythmic, deliberate, echoing through the trees. The same clicking sound described in the observation logs. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the clearing, but the beam only penetrated maybe 30 feet into the darkness. Everything beyond that was just shadows and massive tree trunks. The clicking continued, coming from different directions now, left, then right, then behind me. Whatever was making the sound was moving around my position, staying just out of sight. I thought about Hale's words. They don't scream, they talk. Was this communication? Was something trying to tell me something? I stood frozen in the center of my clearing, flashlight in hand, trying to decide what to do. Running seemed stupid. I'd never outpaced something that knew this terrain, something that could move through this forest in complete darkness. Fighting was pointless. I'd seen the size of R14 in the footage. These creatures could break me in half without effort. So I did the only thing I could think of. I spoke out loud into the darkness. I said I wasn't there to hurt anything, that I was just trying to understand what had happened. That I knew about R14, about how it had helped those lost hikers, about how it had been taken and then released. My voice sounded small and foolish in the vast silence of the forest. The clicking stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard something moving in the trees to my right. Not crashing through the undergrowth like a bear would, but deliberate footfalls, heavy and measured. I turned my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something massive, maybe 40 feet away. A shape too tall to be human, standing between two massive redwood trunks. It stepped sideways, moving deeper into the shadows, and I lost sight of it. But for that brief moment, I'd seen enough. The broad shoulders, the massive frame, the way it moved with that same deliberate gait I'd seen in the footage. It was real. All of it was real. I heard more movement now from multiple directions. Wood knocking started up. That rhythmic sound of something striking hollow logs. It was all around me, creating this acoustic pattern that seemed to bounce off the trees and echo through the forest. I realized with a mixture of terror and awe that I was surrounded. Just like the capture team had been 30 years ago, just like the facility had been that night in the storm. But nothing attacked, nothing rushed forward. They were just there, in the darkness, making their presence known, reminding me that this was their home, that I was the intruder. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, the sounds began to recede. The clicking and wood knocking moved away, getting fainter and fainter until finally the forest was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in hand, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came and gray light filtered through the canopy, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and hiked back to my car. My hands were shaking the entire drive back to civilization. Before I left the area, I found something that made me certain of what I'd experienced. Near the edge of my campsite, pressed into soft earth, was a footprint, 18 inches long, clearly showing 5 toes and an arch. Not bear, not human, but something in between. I took pictures from every angle, measurements, detailed notes. Then I left it there, undisturbed. It wasn't proof I needed to share with the world. It was proof I needed for myself. So why am I sharing all of this now? Why break my silence after keeping quiet for so long? Part of it is that Hale is gone, and with him went the last official connection to Operation Redwood. His death released me from a promise I'd made to be careful, to not put him at risk by going public while he was alive. But more than that, I think the story needs to be told because it challenges everything we think we know about what's out there. These creatures exist, not as folklore, not as myth, but as real, living beings with intelligence and social structures and families they're willing to die for. The government knows this. They've known it for decades. They captured one, studied it, and then quietly buried the evidence because they didn't know what to do with it. The footage I found wasn't a smoking gun that proved Bigfoot exists. It was documentation of a mistake, of humans trying to control and catalog something that should have been left alone. R14 didn't escape that facility. It was released by a man who recognized that keeping it locked up was morally wrong, regardless of the scientific value it might have provided. I've gone back to the archive system since my experience in the forest. My access is still blocked for anything related to Redwood, which tells me someone is still monitoring that information, still keeping it classified. But I've found other references, small mentions in other documents that suggest Operation Redwood wasn't the only program. There have been other sightings, other encounters, other close calls that never made it into public knowledge. The question isn't whether these creatures exist. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we hunt them down, capture them, study them like lab specimens? Or do we accept that there are still wild places in this world, still mysteries we're not meant to solve, still beings that deserve to live without human interference? Hale made his choice 30 years ago. He chose to let R14 go, to give it back to its family, even though it meant ending his career and living with questions that would never be answered. I think about that choice every day. About the courage it took to admit that human curiosity doesn't justify everything, that some things are more important than scientific advancement. I still have the original tape, the one labeled Container 14, Redwood. It sits in a safe deposit box along with copies of the observation logs and my own notes from that night in the forest. I've thought about releasing it, about uploading the footage to the internet where it can't be suppressed. But I haven't. Not yet. Maybe I'm being cowardly. Maybe I should share everything I have and let the world decide what it means. But I keep thinking about those creatures in the darkness, making their clicking sounds, letting me know I was surrounded but never threatening me. They could have done anything that night. They could have made me disappear like so many other people who ventured too deep into those forests, but they didn't. I think they were giving me a message, the same message they gave the capture team and the facility that night in the storm. They're aware of us. They know we're out there, that we have our cameras and our weapons and our insatiable curiosity. but they're choosing to remain hidden, to avoid us, to live their lives in the deep forests where humans rarely go. Maybe that's how it should stay. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe the fact that these creatures exist, that they're out there living alongside us in ways we barely understand, maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing they're real is different from needing to prove it to everyone else. But I've started to hear things, whispers in the government contractor community about renewed interest in cryptid research, about new programs being funded under different names. Apparently the Bigfoot question never really went away, it just went deeper underground. And that worries me, because if they're hunting again, if they're planning another capture, then our 14 sacrifice was for nothing. So I'm telling the story as a warning. To the researchers who think capturing one of these creatures is worth the cost. To the agencies that believe everything in nature exists to be cataloged and controlled. To anyone who hears clicking sounds in the forest and thinks about following them deeper into the trees. If you ever hear that clicking in the woods, don't run. They don't hunt the way we think. They're not aggressive unless threatened. They're watching to see whether we learned anything from the night we locked one of them in a box. Whether we understand that intelligence and awareness demand respect, not capture and study. Hale's final words to me were that they talk. Not scream, not growl, but talk. That means language, culture, society. All the things that we use to define humanity, they have too, just in different forms, in different ways. The Bigfoot clans of the Pacific Northwest aren't animals. They're people. Different from us, but people nonetheless. The footage exists. The logs exist. The evidence is out there if you know where to look. But more importantly, they exist. In the deep forests, in the places we can't easily reach, living their lives the way they have for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years. Long before humans thought we owned every inch of this planet. I'm not sharing this story to convince skeptics. I'm sharing it because people deserve to know what their government did, what they tried to hide, and what one brave agent chose to do. Instead, Hale could have gone along with the program, could have let them transport R-14 to some black site where it would have spent the rest of its life in a cage. Instead, he opened the door and let it go home. That's the kind of courage we need more of. The courage to admit when we're wrong, when we've crossed a line we shouldn't have crossed. The courage to value the unknown over the known, to protect mystery rather than destroy it in pursuit of answers. So this is my account of what happened. The leaked footage, the observation logs, the night in the forest where I stood surrounded by creatures that could have killed me but chose not to. All of it is true. Every word, whether you believe it or not, is up to you. But if you're ever hiking in the Pacific Northwest and you hear clicking sounds in the darkness, remember what I'm telling you. Stand still, be respectful. And maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a glimpse of something incredible. Something that proves we don't know everything about this world we live in. Just don't try to capture it. Don't try to prove it to anyone else. Let it be. Let them be. They've earned that much from us. That's all I have to say. Make of it what you will. For more interesting stories, check this out.